Thank you so much for being here today. Welcome, welcome. We're really glad to have you for our webinar today, Creating Effective Global Regulatory Plans, Strategies for Success Across Markets. I'm Gay Esther, the Marketing Manager here at RegDesk, and RegDesk is an AI-powered regulatory information management platform with built-in regulatory intelligence. Our platform allows RA teams to leverage AI to prepare, manage, and publish international submissions smarter and faster. To focus on you for a minute, I just want to say we truly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be here today. We know that you have tons of other ways that you can spend your time, so we appreciate you being here with us today. As you participate in this, feel free to ask questions. You can drop them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll take the last 5 to 10 minutes at the end to go over those questions. And if we don't get to those, we'll be sure to share them when we share the slide deck and the presentation with you after the webinar. And along with that, too, I know we've promised this wonderful checklist, and Jodi spent some time putting this together for you, and it's going to be super valuable. She's going to cover some of the topics during the webinar, but then we'll give you the checklist towards the end, and you can take that. And if you have any questions, just let us know. Let me take a moment now to introduce our expert, Jodi. Jodi Granger is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at RegDesk. Jodi brings over 36 years of experience in quality and regulatory roles within the medical device and IVD industry. She has leadership roles in been overseeing global regulatory teams and driving the development and execution of regulatory strategies for all classes of medical devices worldwide. So thank you so much for being here today, Jodi. We really appreciate you taking time to be here with us as well. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, so you can go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Gay. I appreciate it. And I echo your appreciation to everybody that's on the call. I absolutely understand a regulatory professional has a very busy day. So spending a little time with us, we appreciate it. And I hope that you'll find value in the content that we are providing today. So we're going to walk through, as Gay said, talking about creating global regulatory plans. We'll discuss the importance of them, key elements and consideration that you should certainly assess during the creation of those plans. We'll talk about navigating regional regulatory differences. As you know, all markets have their own unique little nuance. So how do you manage that when you're creating a regulatory plan? We'll talk about the importance of cross-functional collaboration and getting internal alignment on the plan as a whole. We also, in a regulatory environment, much of what we've done historically has been manual. So we'll talk a little bit about the types of tools that you can consider bringing on board in your organization to make the regulatory planning process and the entire overall timeline for those plans a little easier to manage. I'll talk about some real world lessons, some things that I've actually faced in my career with regulatory plans and, what happened as a result of those real world examples. And then again, at the end, as Gay said, we will give time for Q&A. You can put your questions in the chat. We'll select from those at the end of the meeting, and I'll go through answers to as many as possible. And then we will be sure that we take all those questions and provide written answers to you after the webinar. So in terms of the importance of a regulatory plan, many regulatory professionals are tasked with creating these regulatory plans on a routine basis. They need to be created for new devices that are being developed within your organization. And then also, sometimes you're doing significant modifications of existing products, and having a written global regulatory plan for those types of large changes is also very critical. The plans are intended to give the organization a better understanding of the regulatory requirements that you're going to have for each of those products. What are the costs? What are the timelines? As you know, many times everyone just wants to know, when can we market this stuff? When can we get approvals? So developing that plan thoughtfully will help you provide those answers in the most transparent way to the organization. One key thing that you'll hear me kind of echo throughout this presentation is that being prepared for one market does not mean that you are prepared to pursue regulatory submissions globally. Many companies like to focus sometimes on the US or the EU market first. That is, those are the submissions that they want done as a priority. But the decisions that you're making early on need to be more global in nature. You need to ensure that you are looking at the global requirements in order to ensure that you can successfully launch in a broader area at a later date. So development of this plan, one of the key things that I've learned in my career is that you need to document defined key assumptions. A regulatory pathway or a plan will substantially change if those assumptions change. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you need to make sure that within this plan, you are looking at the key assumptions in order to ensure that you can pursue clearance or approvals in all markets. We'll walk through now some key elements and considerations as you're creating these plans. The first is understanding what it is you're going to submit. You need to understand the key device characterization for your product. There's a lot of characteristics for the product that you need to identify. They include intended use or indications for use. You need to understand what the product classification and risk level is for each market. A detailed technical specification and understanding all the components that are going to be in the package is important. Depending on the market, if you have accessories to a device, sometimes you have to file separately for the accessory versus the primary device. So all of these factors are really critical when you're starting to create the regulatory plan. A change in these attributes, as I mentioned before, can really affect the strategy. If you go in with the assumption that your indication for use is going to be, for a peripheral balloon catheter, as an example, and then the company decides that they want to actually have another indication for neurovascular use, that is a very large change, and it will affect your regulatory plan. In addition, the key specifications of your product can change that strategy as well. If you decide that you're creating a product that has certain attributes like the length of the device, something as simple as that, and now you've decided you want to offer longer lengths, well, that may change what you use as a predicate device in the US. So having at least the key detailed specifications identified to create your plan is really important. And we'll talk a little later about changes to those key attributes and the impact that they can have on your initial plan. You also need to understand what countries the product will be sold in. Many companies, as I mentioned, like to focus on the US or the EU first, but understanding where they ultimately want to sell is very important. And your regulatory plan should cover all global markets that you intend. With that, you will need to determine what the critical path items are for each of those markets, and it will change. In the US, maybe your critical path item is your validation data or your clinical data. If you are trying to do submissions in other markets like Brazil or the Middle East, the key critical path item might be obtaining your CFG. If you're a US manufacturer, those countries will expect you to provide a certificate of foreign government. You can't obtain that document until you have US approval. So that will become your critical path item. Clinical data often is critical path as well. Sometimes the translated labeling or the documentation. So for each of these markets that you intend to sell your product in, it's very important to understand what that critical path item is. The timing that you're going to map out is contingent upon that. If you have a delay in US approval so that it delays when you can obtain a CFG, then that's going to impact all the markets that require that document. So having those interdependencies clearly mapped out, document for each country what you've selected as the critical path item. All of that is really important. A regulatory plan that simply looks at, these are the 12 countries I want to go to, here's the approval time, doesn't give enough information to the organization to really plan their launch strategy. It has to get much more detailed than that. In addition, it's important to know who your local representative or license holder is going to be. If you're a large organization, many times you have entities in different countries. They're going to do the submissions for those markets. In other cases, many smaller companies utilize distributors. You need to identify who those distributors are and if they're going to be your license holder. And if those distributors change over time, then you may have to resubmit. So identifying who the license holder is going to be in each market, and if you need a local representative, is also very important. You can add additional markets later. Say initially the company wants to go to 20 markets. A year later, they decide they need to add an additional 5 markets. You can certainly do that. But what's important is that it's not always easy to add other markets if the requirements for that market are different. So I'll give an example, for products where you have to have shelf life testing in a specific zone. If you have not marketed or not done testing within that zone, it's going to be difficult for you to add that market at a later date. So it's important to connect with your marketing professionals, your development teams, and really understand what is the long-term plan for this device, and factor in, even if you're going to have your launches staggered over time, factor in all of the regulatory requirements for every market that you believe is feasible for this device on the front end. One example I have here is for a vaginal speculum. So if you initially think, oh, we want to just market in the US, it's class 1 510K exempt in the United States. There's certainly requirements that you'll need to meet the US market. But then there's an interest in the company in going to China. China, for a vaginal speculum, has very specific guidance documents, and they have requirements that are not applicable to the United States. So if your development team has completed their work and they've moved on to other projects, and now you want to go to a market where you didn't factor in these specific changes, you're going to be delayed in even attempting to pursue regulatory approval in China. So as I said, the key takeaway to this is think globally. Make sure that you're looking at all the specific requirements of your device in any potential market that you may want to go to, even if you're not going to go to them all this year when you get your initial approvals in the US or EU. The second area element to consider are just the regulatory requirement assessment. It's important, once you have that global list and your markets are identified, to look at if there's unique standards that are required for a particular device. It's important to understand the regulations within that market There may be different clinical data requirements for your device. Just because there isn't clinical data required in the US doesn't mean that it's not going to be required in the EU. We know under EU MDR that those requirements have certainly escalated, and it's a big burden on companies to be able to meet that new threshold in Europe. You also have to understand if there's country-specific labeling requirements, not just the translation into the language, but many companies also, or countries also have labeling requirements such that you have to put the license number on the label once you have approval. China is an example of that. Some require that you have your in-country representative on the label. And so all of those factors need to be, determined up front so that you can figure out how you're going to manage that once you get to the approval stage. The company will want to know if there's any registration fees and expected timelines. Those are base information that every regulatory plan should have. Even if the registration fees are being covered by another party, like a distributor, it's still important to map those out so that the company can understand what the return on investment is going to be for that market. You'll need to understand what your post-market requirements are and QMS requirements as well. If you want to go to Canada as an example, but your company does not have an MDSAP certificate, then you are going to be blocked from that market. You cannot register a device in Canada and gain approval without that MDSAP certificate. So it immediately blocks you from the market. Some other countries that accept MDSAP, it isn't a mandatory certificate. They'll have other audit pathways that you could take in lieu of having the MDSAP certificate in place. So it's important when assessing timing to understand if these audits are going to be required prior to you gaining approval of a product in a given market. UDI is another example. That is changing over time. So it's important to understand what the UDI requirements are for each country so that you can factor that into your plan. The best scenario is that once you've identified these markets, the critical RA requirements are then factored into your design input document. So if you have a shelf life requirement, as an example, where you need to go in specific zones, then you should have that in your design input document. That's what you should be developing your product to meet. So it's important to do that. This is an example on the shelf life. If you look at different markets in the US, a specific zone is not required. There are real-time aging not required in the US in order to gain approval. But then if you look at Brazil as an example, you have to have your shelf life done in the zone 4A for Brazil. So these are the kinds of nuances of regulatory requirements that often get overlooked early on in the development process. But they're critical to understand on the front end because shelf life takes a long time. And so it's important to understand where you're going to sell and make sure that the testing that's being done on these products is going to meet the need for each of these markets. This is just one example of an area that if you factor this into your design input document, then you'll make sure that you're covered. And it's really critical for the success or overall launch of a product to get to this level of detail in your plans and in your design input. In terms of navigating regional regulatory differences, I always say there's famous last words. When you ask as a regulatory professional, well, where do you want to sell? The typical response is we want to sell everywhere. We're going to go everywhere. That's fine, but you need to understand that there are regulatory burdens in each market, and that should be fully understood by the organization before that final country list is finalized. It's not that you don't want them to sell everywhere, but they need to understand what that means in terms of testing. Regional regulatory differences can impact your launch strategy. You're not going to get all of the approvals in place at one time. So it's important to align your launch strategy with the plan. And if the plan is not done to the level that is really required, then your launch strategy is going to fall apart. And then you're going to miss the forecast that's been put into place. And of course, nobody likes to report that up to upper management that, we thought we were going to be able to start selling in September, but it looks like it's actually going to be, April of the following year. It's especially critical with these plans if you are doing a major change or modification to a device, because if you make a significant change, such as legal manufacturer is a great example, you need to be able to map all of those factors out for an organization in order to be successful. What you don't want is to have product that you're currently selling, and then some regulatory hurdle is going to take you off the market in a given country because the regulatory path and the planning kind of fell apart at the end. So we know approvals do not all occur at the same time. They will vary in every country. We do not have control over how long a regulatory authority will take for approval, and it will vary. There are standard expectations, but we know that it is highly variable in terms of what questions you're going to receive and when those approvals are actually going to come in. So it's important, as I mentioned, to look at all of the requirements in each market as you're developing these plans. They will all factor into your launch strategy. In terms of cross-functional collaboration and internal alignment, RA really needs a seat at the table very early on in the design process. Bringing a regulatory professional in when you're ready to start validating your product is too late. You've already designed it. You've determined how the product is going to perform. You've determined the specification and you're ready to validate. That's way too late. You need to understand if you're going to be selling this product globally, any of those nuances that we discussed earlier for each market, in order to ensure that you're developing something that's going to be saleable globally. So it's important that regulatory has a seat at the table early. That gets challenging in some companies. Some companies have not, realized the importance of getting regulatory involved in conversations early on. So if you're sitting at a company where that's the case, I strongly urge you, work with your cross-functional teams, push to get a seat at the table so that you can best help guide them throughout their development process. The critical path items, as I mentioned, for each market will dictate what the launch strategy is going to be. Inventory planning and forecasts need to align with the expected approval in each market. This, again, is especially essential if you're making a change to a product that you already sell. You do not want to have missed expectations and then end up being off the market because you weren't able to get that modified device approved in the time that you had inventory to support. I also strongly suggest that companies look at building in an ROI assessment of the regulatory costs versus the expected sales. A return on investment assessment just helps guide the company not only on what markets should we really be going after when we look at the regulatory costs, but also what the prioritization should be. What submission should the teams focus on first? That's really important because many companies, there's limited resources, not only in regulatory, but other functions as well. So making sure that you're applying those resources to the market where you're going to have the largest return on investment or impact is critical. As I said, many companies say we want to sell everywhere. That's great, but I need to be able to resource those submissions. So I find that a return on investment assessment is really helpful in guiding those discussions on where you want to dedicate your regulatory resources first, what markets you're going to go after first, and then plan accordingly from there. In terms of tools and technology, creating a regulatory plan is not as easy as it sounds. I've sat through a lot of design review meetings as an example where one of the items you're required to address during those design reviews are what your regulatory plan is. And many times I've seen a simple table, it lists the countries out, it lists approximate duration for approval, and that is it. And they check the box and they say, well, we've covered the regulatory plan as a deliverable for our design review meeting. That regulatory plan, if you leave it as simple as that, is not going to be successful. You need to look at all the factors that play into the markets you want to go to and ensure that the details are assessed. You need to look at your QMS requirements. What are the requirements for clinical data? Are you going to need to do a clinical trial in that market specifically because they want patients that are meeting their demographic? Some countries have importation requirements, so there might be specific labeling or other requirements that you need to ensure are addressed. UDI, we mentioned before. Labeling, not only the language and the translation, but is an electronic IFU accepted? That's another area where I've seen some companies have a misstep where they've developed the product assuming that there's going to be an EIFU, but then that blocks you from other markets. So if you've done your packaging validation, your transit testing, you've designed your packaging all around no paper in the box with an electronic IFU, then that assumption may block you from markets. So those are the kinds of things that need to be factored into your plan. Packaging and shelf life is important. Post-market surveillance and adverse event reporting. Are there renewal requirements? So there's ongoing maintenance of licenses. So when you're looking at return on investment, not only do you have to look at the initial submission costs, but you're going to have to do a renewal in 3 years or 5 years. So it's important to understand what markets do have renewal requirements. The establishment license requirements, some markets require your facility to have a separate establishment license, and that part of the regulatory process needs to be addressed. Each market also has a different classification and risk structure. We looked at vaginal speculums earlier on an earlier slide, and you'll see that the risk class in the US was different than a market like China. So understanding those differences and how that may impact the data that is required to support submissions is important. If you need an in-country representative, this would be a license holder in a given market. It's important to understand that so that you have those in place. There's also a number of other requirements that you need to have on your regulatory intelligence side. If you have software in your device, what are the requirements in each market? If there's a component of animal origin, cybersecurity requirements, If you have a radiation emitting device, there's going to be separate requirements for that, as well as a wireless device if your device has Bluetooth. So all of these things impact your submission plan and your regulatory plan. So creating a table that simply says country, expected approval time, is not going to get you very far if you haven't addressed all of these elements. So having tools in place to ensure that you have that regulatory intelligence is really critical. If you're going to a very broad base of countries and you're a small organization, you may need help in order to get that regulatory intelligence needed to develop these plans. The second area where tools and technology can come into play is the submission preparation and deliverable collaboration. So RA needs to identify for the internal teams what documents are going to be needed for each submission. You know, it's not just a 510K, it's not just an EU tech doc. There are other documents that might be required for other markets. So understanding what all those deliverables are, planning for them, and generating them in a timely manner will impact when you can submit. So it's important to have tools in place to help create checklists of those required documents, who owns them, who's responsible for delivering them, and then being able to track that progress over time will help you ensure that you can meet your regulatory plan and the dates that you've established. It's important that if you do have tools in this regard, where you're tracking all of these deliverables, that you are able to collaborate. It's easier to collaborate within a tool than it is to try to cover all of this by email. So, you know, if you look at all the markets that you're going to be in, this is just one example where this is for China, for a Class 3 device. There are 36 documents required just for that one country to be able to submit a Class 3 device. So to not have tools in place to be able to track all of those deliverables, and then you add 20 other countries on top of that who have their own unique set of deliverables, that's going to be really challenging for the regulatory team to process. So I strongly encourage companies to look at tools to help manage all of these elements because that will help you ensure that your regulatory plan is successful. Another tool that is important is a change control management tool. So if your regulatory plan is being developed for a change to an existing device, then documenting that regulatory impact assessment is absolutely required for every country where you currently sell. The process should be able to, first of all, identify what markets. So where are you selling today? You need to be able to easily tell that for every SKU or product that is impacted by this change. You need to allow for the regulatory assessment to be completed for each of those markets. So as I mentioned before, sometimes you have a distributor who owns the license in a given country, or you have regional regulatory teams that are, you know, part of your corporation. Each of them need to be able to do their assessment of the change, and all of those assessments need to be documented. Many times, I'm sure all of you have sat through audits where one of the first things they say is, tell me the change controls that you've done on this device since last year, since we were last here auditing. And you'll have to give a list of those change controls to the auditor. From there, they might select one and say, okay, we want to see where you did these regulatory assessments for all of the countries where you market that product. And so having that tool in place to document that is really important for auditing purposes, and also to allow the regulatory actions to be identified and then executed. If a change requires a submission, you're going to need to plan for that submission and understand when the approvals are going to come into place. You cannot sell a modified product into a market if they said a submission is required until that approval is received. So since all of those approvals are not going to come in at the same time, you need to understand in a corporation how you're going to manage the inventory. How are we going to be able to supply the non-modified product at the same time as, perhaps implementing the modified product in some markets. So the regulatory plan is really designed to ensure that you're covering all of that for the company, because if you don't get it right, then it can have significant impact on the organization. The last area that I want to talk about in terms of tools and technology is tracking. Most folks in regulatory will say, you get asked all the time, what is the status? Where have we submitted? Where are we waiting on regulatory approval? Have we received questions from the regulatory bodies? And so all of the activities that go through the regulatory process really need to be tracked so that it's easily reportable to management. First of all, you need to determine, is a submission needed? What is required to submit? So that list of deliverables that we mentioned, who owns those deliverables and when will they be provided? You'll want to know when you've done the submission and what the plan or what the plan submission date is and when you expect the approval. If you've received questions from the regulatory authority, we'll use EU MDR as an example. You've submitted your EU MDR application to your notified body, and you many times will go through multiple rounds of questions. You need to manage those questions and ensure that you get responses in order to get your approvals. So all of that becomes a great deal of information that you're trying to track within an organization, depending on how many in-flight applications you have. And once your approval is in place, it's also important to understand when the license might expire. So renewals may be required, and it's important to plan for those in advance. You want to make sure that you've submitted your renewal application in plenty of time to get approval so that you don't have a lapse where you cannot sell. So that's also important. So a tracking tool that looks at your overall regulatory plan and makes sure that you are able to manage all of these activities over time is really important. So, in terms of the tracking tool, folks have many different things. You can use an Excel file, but ultimately, as I said, you just want to be able to communicate to upper management the status. How many submissions are approved, how many are in flight, are we waiting on health authority response to us? So it's important, to look at getting tools in place to make your process more efficient. In terms of real-world lessons, I'm going to just go through a few of them today to just try to highlight why a regulatory plan is so important. So these are real examples that I have lived through. So the first is, a company develops a new medical device, but the product development team is focused on just getting the 510(k) submission in. So when they were developing all of the design requirements, et cetera, they were purely focused on the US. Leadership had told stockholders, hey, we're going to get 510(k) clearance this year. So everybody was heads down, and that's what they were focused on. As soon as that 510(k) clearance came in, leadership, of course, says, okay, we want to start selling everywhere. So we need to see when we can get these approvals in all the markets. So regulatory was brought in and said, okay, now we want to go, to these 20 additional countries. When can you submit? And RA identified a bunch of gaps in order to be able to do that. One example of a gap was that the IFU was only available in English. Okay, no problem, management says. You just translate the IFU and let's move on. That's not a big deal, right? Well, unfortunately, due to the added languages, the IFU size increased significantly. If you have only an English translation and then you add 20 additional languages, that size is going to increase. The global IFU would not fit in the current packaging. It would not fit in the box. So a new package had to be redesigned. Because of that, it impacted your transit testing data, your packaging validation data, your shelf life data, and all of that had to be repeated with the newly designed package and IFU in place. And as a result, they couldn't even attempt to go to other global markets for a year. That was the earliest we would have all the deliverables to support a market. And in some cases, it was even further because we had to wait for shelf life data in different zones to support it. So because the regulatory plan in this example was not developed to look at all markets where the company intended to sell, and the development team just pursued what data they needed to support the US 510K, there was a significant delay in being able to launch this product elsewhere. So that's one example of a regulatory plan that unfortunately was not done early enough globally to make the launch of this product successful. The second real world lesson that I have lived through, the company has decided to change the legal manufacturer of the device. The reason for this is they were going to shut down a plant and they were going to move the product to another location. And because they wanted to shut this plant down, upper management looked at the lease for the current manufacturing site and they did not renew it. They said, okay, we're going to be out of here by the end of 2025. These decisions were made without any regulatory input or a regulatory plan being created. So once these decisions were made, the lease was not signed, RA was asked, please generate a regulatory plan, which they did. And they identified the lead time for approvals for all the global markets ranged from 30 to 365 days. That's once you submitted. The validation data and supporting documents were not going to be available until September. So approvals from there would extend out until at least December of 2026 in some markets. The current manufacturing facility was unable to build enough inventory to bridge that gap. That is a long time to have product on your shelves in order to support your markets globally. So as a result, in this scenario, customers in some markets were without product for over a year, and we did not get those customers back. They moved on to competitive products, and it was purely the result of not having a robust regulatory plan documented and created for this significant change. So again, this is just another example of the importance of those regulatory plans. The next real world lesson I'll share was also something that I've lived through. The company initiated a project to develop a new PTCA catheter. RA was brought into the project team at the end of the feasibility phase. The design input document was written and a regulatory review was required. So as RA went through this document, they identified some gaps in the design input. And one of the gaps that they identified was it stated only English was required for the IFU. So regulatory said that's not going to work if you want to sell globally. So you should change that requirement to ensure that you cover all languages for markets. The second thing that was identified was material selection. So the design input document did not clearly state that substances of very high concern should be excluded. Otherwise, you would have to put a warning on the product, which your competitors do not have. And that warning would end up giving you a competitive disadvantage. By building in a requirement in your design input document related to those substances of very high concern, they were able to avoid having to put that warning in place. The last gap that was identified was that the rated burst pressure was available in the document, but it did not list the statistical confidence intervals that were required by regulatory authorities. So RA was able to point this out, and it was incorporated. So because regulatory was involved in this case and able to identify each of these gaps, they were corrected. They were corrected on the front end prior to data being generated by the project team. And so at the end of the day, we had everything we needed in order to fully support the global submissions. So this is how you get it done right. You bring regulatory in at the very front end. You make sure that the regulatory team is thorough and that they are looking at all of the requirements for each of the countries so that you don't have these gaps and these mistakes further down the pipeline later in the design phases. So key takeaways from the presentation that I'd like to share is that a well-developed global regulatory plan is really essential for a successful launch of any new or modified product. Having these plans in place, if they're done well, will allow you to avoid unnecessary rework by the project teams, or unfortunately, in some cases, you'd be limited on actually where the product can be sold. You want to avoid that upfront by developing these clear regulatory plans. Organizations should always think globally. Even if you aren't going to sell globally right out of the gate, your phase one launch strategy, it's still important that you look at global requirements from a design input standpoint and a regulatory plan standpoint, because looking at requirements later results in rework or just being able to skip a particular market because you can't meet the requirement. Investing in tools to aid the regulatory processes can really streamline submission and approval times. So look at tools that might be available. We discussed the key elements that you might want to look at for those tools, but that will help make sure that you're executing the regulatory plan in the most efficient way. So in terms of Q&A, we can now move on to Q&A. I'll hand it over to Gay.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jodi. I know that was such valuable information for everybody, so we hope you appreciate all that. I did just put the checklist in the chat, so you can have that there. We will also share it with you via email after this and along with everything else. So be on the lookout for that, but if you want it ahead of time, it's in the chat. We do have a couple questions that came in our chat and in the Q&A. So the first question, Jodi, is how do you think the U.S. reciprocal tariffs will affect a global regulatory plan?
Oh, well, the tariffs, I think from a regulatory perspective, where it comes into play is especially sourcing of components. So if you are getting components from markets that are being tariffed at this time, it can really impact things in that maybe the tariffs add so much cost, your cost of goods sold, that sourcing that component from those markets is no longer feasible. You can't build a product that you're actually going to have a profit margin. So what that will potentially lead for regulatory teams is, oh, we're going to change where we're buying this stuff. We're going to buy it from someplace in the United States. So it will increase how many changes an organization might actually put in front of regulatory to do those assessments. You're going to have to develop plans for that. And then, being able to manage all of those submissions. So I think there is significant risk in terms of tariffs simply on what threshold a company can absorb in terms of their cost of goods sold. Not all companies are going to be able to absorb that additional 10% or 20% or whatever the tariff happens to be from your sourcing company. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out for regulatory. I imagine we're going to have to deal with a lot more modifications of products if the tariffs go on long enough where a company says, hey, we just can't sustain this.
Great answer. I'm glad you were the one to provide all those details. Another question is, as a contract manufacturer of only human trial device for IDE purpose, we will not manufacture market use devices. Do we need to register our facility with FDA for IDE purposes? And then another question on top of that is, we are not the owner of IDE. Will we need to have any devices to list in FURLS, FURLS?
This is something I'd have to actually look at that and provide the answer later. The IDE specific facilities, I don't have a lot of experience in that, but I can certainly provide an answer when we send the questions out. If you don't own the IDE itself, but you're manufacturing the device, then the requirements should be being provided to you from the company that is actually submitting the IDE. But I will definitely look at that a little more closely to see if I can give a better answer in the responses that we'll send out in writing.
Okay, perfect. Another question, if you are struggling with your company getting a seat at the table for RA early in the design process, what do you suggest so you can ensure regulatory requirements are considered?
Yeah, this is hard because many companies they haven't learned those hard lessons yet. Some of the real world examples that I gave you, and so I think the only way to really change the culture in an organization is to just be communicating with your cross-functional team. Give them examples as to why it is important to understand these things on the front end. I wish I could have had, all of the operations, R&D, and other teams, other functions really joining calls like this that can really explain the value of a good, thorough, developed regulatory plan early on. But the best you can do is really just speak up with the management, work with your cross-functional teams, try to explain the risk involved if you're not on the front end, and that's the best you can do. I would also say, document things with those discussions. One thing I forgot to mention when I was doing the review, the key assumptions for your regulatory plan should always be put in writing as part of that plan, because that is what determines your regulatory pathways, what submissions might be required. So making sure that you have that documented in the plan is really important as well.
All right, we have a few more questions and a little bit of time left, so let's see if we can get through a couple more. How do you manage design creep or changes being made over time for a new or modified device? And how do you manage the regulatory plan as these changes are made?
Your regulatory plan needs to be dynamic because your design review process is dynamic as well. So when you create the initial plan, your Rev 1 of that plan, you will have a list of assumptions, what the product is going to be, what your intended use is, what the key attributes are. If those change over time, then the organization needs to understand that regulatory assessment that was done has to be revised. So you would go to Rev 2 on your regulatory plan and you make updates as needed. So maybe it changes a decision in terms of the type of submission that's required. So I like to say that in every design phase that gets presented to the organization, it's really important for the regulatory person in those meetings to have gone through and reassess their regulatory plan at each of those phases so that you can present new and updated timelines.
Okay, and then another question is, if requirements in a given market are unknown, how do you develop a final regulatory plan?
Um, there's That's where your regulatory intelligence comes in. So if internally you do not know what the regulatory requirements are for a market that has been identified as required, you need to get that regulatory intelligence somehow in order to develop the plan. So whether you engage consultants or you engage a company that provides that regulatory intelligence to you, that's ultimately what needs to be done. If you don't have that data at the time of creating the plan, then it's important to list that in the plan as unknown at that time. You don't want to just guess and put, oh, it's going to be, a full submission or whatever the case may be. You don't want to just guess and put it in there because they're going to think you've done the work and you know what the pathway is. So if you don't know, make sure it's documented as an open item. Gather the regulatory intelligence that you need to develop the plan for that country, and then you can move forward.
Okay, and then we're going to try to fit in one last question. Should an organization have a requirement for a written regulatory plan, or is covering this during the design review meetings adequate?
My view on that is that absolutely there should be a requirement for a written regulatory plan, and it should be detailed enough where all of the elements that we talked about today are really addressed. So as I mentioned, I've sat in some companies that I've worked at or consulted for where they have a table presented in a design review meeting that simply lists the country, the expected duration of approval, and planned approval date. And it never turned out well. So developing those key, very thorough plans is essential to success. So I think every company should have a process in place and a requirement of the minimum amount of information that's needed as part of their QMS system.
All right, well, it looks like we're just at the last minute, so I'm going to wrap everything up. So thank you again to everyone for coming and joining us today and for participating. I know, Jodi, I learned a ton from all the valuable information you provided, so I'm sure everyone else did as well. So we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us as well. As we promised, we will send out the replay, the presentation, the Q&A, and the checklist in the next couple of days, so be on the lookout for that via your email. And if you want any additional questions about, or have any additional questions or want more information about RegDesk, I put our website in the chat, and then I also put my email address in there. So feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any additional questions or input about the webinar or anything else that you want to see from RegDesk. So thanks again, everyone. Hope you have a great day. Thanks again, Jodi.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.